Will Robinson here from Robinson's Auto, toolsandtime.com. Welcome back, guys. Behind me you might recognize this Mitsubishi Eclipse. It's a 96. It's the same Eclipse that we did the transmission replacement on in the clutch job in the previous videos about a month ago. He's very happy with the clutch and the transmission job. Therefore, he brought his car back for some more repairs. Initially, he had a kind of a wish list that he generated when he first brought it in. But he initially just wanted to get the clutch and the transmission out of the way. Therefore, he brought it back due to this pulsation issue. That was the second priority on the list that he wanted to take care of. What he was experiencing when he was driving down the road, he would apply the brakes and he'd have a bad pulsation in the front. And that's a good indication of warped rotors. So when I was doing the training job, I did some inspection and I could see hot spots on the rotor. And you can tell it's evident that they're warped. After getting some prices, we found that it was just about the same price, just a little more to just replace everything instead of having the rotors cut. So once you have the rotors cut, you're taking off material, more chances of warp, you got less material. So we'll be replacing the front pads and rotors today. Alright, let's do it to it. Okay, the first thing you're going to want to do is get the front of the vehicle raised and securely seated on the jack stands. And then you go ahead and remove the wheels. And then let me take you in. We'll get started. First, you're going to want to remove your caliper. There's two 17mm head bolts. One here, one here. Let's take and remove them. Those are your caliper pins as well. I usually take and break them both loose first. Another thing, check the level in your reservoir, your brake fluid reservoir. If it's really high before you start, take and suck some out, like a turkey baster or something in that manner. And take it down so it's like an inch low or so. Because usually as your brake pads wear and that piston travels out, the fluid will drop. And sometimes people think that it's low on fluid and they'll top it off until it's at its maximum. And then when you go to do a brake job and you go to compress the piston back into the caliper, it pushes the fluid up and out of the reservoir. So if you want to prevent a mess, take and suck some of that fluid out if somebody did add some. In this case, it's okay. Take notice how these pins come out as well. This one here had a bushing and it came out at the top, so I'll put that in the same spot. Like I mentioned, these pads aren't in that bad a shape. It's just the fact that the rotors are warped. So if I'm going to put new rotors on it, might as well put new pads on it. As you can see, this one doesn't have the bushing. Take and remove that. Bring this up here. Here you see me compressing the caliper. This is a necessary step to allow room for the new brake pads. You may see this done in different ways. However, I never had a problem doing it this way. Going nice and slow. They got specialty tools for this. However, a set of welding clamps work great. Because the pads aren't going to go past the housing of the caliper, so if you're flush with that, that's more than enough. You're going to feel a little resistance due to the fact that it's forcing the fluid up through the brake lines into the master cylinder to the brake reservoir. You shouldn't feel any binding. It should be a nice gradual compression. If you feel it binding or get to the point where you can't compress it, that's a sign that the piston has a buildup on it. Therefore, you're either going to have to replace your caliper and or rebuild it, meaning take it apart, clean it, replace the seals, and everything else involved with that. That's a whole nother video. compare each side, meaning the left to the right. The brake pads should have a nice even comparison. There may be a slight difference, but an extreme difference may indicate a sign of a sticky caliper. Also, if you're noticing a brake smell coming from one side, that's another sign of a caliper hanging up, or a brake pull when you apply the brake. If you're pulling to one side or the other, that could be a sign of a sticky caliper as well. I got a little bungee cord I take and I hang this up out of the way to prevent the brake hose from having excess stress put on it from the caliper hanging with its weight. Hang this up out of the way. Like so. New pads. The new pads have shims on them. So, take notice this one, the inside one had the brake indicator on it. I'm just going to put everything back together the same way I took it apart. I'm assuming whoever took it apart last put it back the same way. You'll notice some wetness here. I took and I sprayed penetration oil on this rotor because these are rusting on it pretty good sometimes. Alright, now the caliper bracket. Plus right here is two more shims. These are, they take up space and they act like anti-rattle clips. They're kind of spring loaded to hold your pad from rattling. You're going to want to make sure they're in good shape. These ones don't look bad. And so we're going to proceed to removing the caliper bracket. There's two more bolts in the back. They're 17mm heads as well. They can be tight sometimes, most times. Wow. Let me get a breaker bar. Okay. That one's loose. Break the top one off. For some reason, someone has a bigger head bolt in the top. It should be 17mm, all four of them. I just did the other side and that's all I used on the other side. So for some reason, this one has an oddball. There. Okay, let's take and zip them out. The car also has a bad tie rod end on the right front. I recommended that he did that at the same time. However, he's on a budget, so he wants to do this first. Personally, I probably would have tackled the tie rod first. That one came right loose. So you're something. If they don't come loose for you, get yourself a hammer. You can start a couple lug nuts on here so you don't damage your studs. However, if you hit those studs, they'll bend anyway, so you don't want to hit the studs. You want to take and hit right between the studs. And what that will do is vibrate and jar that rotor loose. If that doesn't work, there's jacking holes. You can take and put bolts in there, and they'll go through the rotor and push on the spindle, which will jack the rotor off. That's another option as well. This one looks really clean. I'm going to take some brake cleaner and spray this down, and then we'll start reassembling everything. Okay, as you can see, I took and I cleaned everything down. I actually hit it with a wire brush to take off any rust buildup. I took and I cleaned all the hard parts with brake cleaner. Took and inspected these clips, these shims. You want to make sure that these aren't pressed up against. They're bent out a little bit. So if these get weak and pushed out of the way, you'll have a rattle with your brake pads. These are kind of anti-rattle clips. And they keep like a spring pressure. I'll show you when we reassemble everything. But right now is a good time to take and put some brake and caliper grease on any metal some metal contact points. Like back in here where those clips are going to be coming in contact with the pads. Believe it or not, that's where most of your brake noise comes from, is people not doing this step. Okay. Another thing you want to do is take your caliper pins, make sure they're nice and free inside the bushings. Which these ones feel nice and there's plenty of lube on there. And we'll put a little extra on there when we put it back together. Now if they're tight, you would take and remove these inserts, like a caliper bushing in there. You take and remove that, and there's probably a rust buildup above that boot. Take and clean that real well. And then 9 times out of 10 you can reuse this grommet that goes inside. But if that tears, you could just get a kit and replace them. Most times when you pull it out, you'll find that it's a buildup on that bore around the perimeter. And then once you clean that bore out, you just hone it out and put that back in, and these will slide nice and smooth, just like this one is. Okay, let's reinstall the rotor. Another thing you want to do is when you get a new rotor, just take and spray it down with brake cleaner and dry it off. It'll evaporate, but just take and spray it down with brake cleaner and wipe it off, because there's a rust prohibitor that they put on these to keep it from rusting on the shelf, or on its shelf life. So you take and you spray that off, otherwise it's just nasty. The smoke, and it'll burn off, but it contaminates the pads and all. So just spray it down with brake cleaner and get everything nice and clean. Alright, let's reinstall the rotor. Another thing I like to do is just take a little bit of Never Sees and put it around that perimeter of that hub, right around there. These things have a tendency of rusting themselves fast, and the next time they'll fall right off. Okay, now you want to look at the condition of the bolts for your caliper bracket. If they're in bad shape, just replace them. If the threads are dirty, take and hit them with a wire wheel. However, these ones look pretty good. And apply a little bit of Never Sees to them. This will make it easier for the next guy. And we just simply reinstall the caliper bracket in the same manner we took it off. I'm doing this in slow motion for you guys. However, I'd be done with this. Just the time it takes me to record this one side, I'd have both sides done and out the door in real time by now. Okay, and then you want to tighten them up and torque them to specs. Okay, I got the 2 bolts in the back for the caliper bracket, tightened down and torqued. Now let's proceed to getting the caliper. I'm taking and inspect everything. I'm going to take and spray this down with some brake cleaner. Okay, since that's all nice and clean, I'm just going to take and hang this back up out of the way for a minute. Let's get the new pads. Okay, we'll start with the inner pad. Like I showed you when we took it apart, it had the wear indicator tab in the top, back side. So I know we put a little brake lube on the bottom, however I'm going to put a little bit on the pads as well, wherever you're going to have metal-to-metal contact. And simply install the brake pads. You just feel a little spring tension from them clips. See, when I push in, it springs back out. That means it's touching those tabs in the back. Do the same thing with the outer pad. Yeah, it's hitting those tabs. Perfect. As you see, these comes with new shims. Okay. Like I said before, you want to take and prep these by cleaning them. You want to take them to a wire wheel, make sure they fit nice inside the bushings, and lube them up real good. Like I mentioned, when we took it apart, the top one had that plastic piece. And now we can take and reinstall the caliper. Okay, you want to get the caliper. We already have it all sprayed down and clean. Here's another spot. Right here is going to be metal contact here and around the piston. So just take some of your brake lube. I get it by the tubs. I know if you go to AutoZone they give you the little packs and everything, but I do so many brake jobs, I got a big tub of it. I'm taking a, simply just apply it wherever it's going to come in contact with the pads. There's a contact point. That's probably about it. Okay. Take your upper pin, install it, install your lower pin, like I mentioned, that's a critical thing to make sure they fit nice and loose. Well, you don't want them too loose, but you want them so they float. Let me show you once I tighten this up. Let's tighten this, tighten these down and torque them to spec. Okay, we're all back together. Let me remove my bungee cord from the back. And let me step over some critical points as far as putting all your brake lube on. Wherever there's metal contact points, that'll avoid a lot of the squeaking noises that you hear. A lot of times when a car comes in, I could eliminate that brake noise by taking them apart and reapplying lube. Another critical point is these bushings. This is what they call a floating caliper. If you notice, when I had that pin out, the only part that there's threads is right where it screws into the caliper itself, and the rest is a pin that goes into the bushing, top and bottom. So that's screwed in here. All that's in that caliper bracket is a pin, and that allows this caliper to float back and forth nice and smooth, just like you're seeing. The reason that is when you apply your brakes, the fluid goes down like a hydraulic cylinder and pushes that piston out. The inner pad will make contact with the inner surface of your rotor, which then will pull, since this is a floating caliper, it'll pull the outer pad into the outer surface of the rotor. And then when you release it, it should float to center. So that's a very critical step to make sure those pins are in good condition and are floating nice. An indication when you take this all apart in your initial steps, if you have a pad that's worn more from your inner to your outer, like say if your outer pad is worn more, that's an indication that your pins are sticking and your pad's staying against the surface of the rotor as you're driving, which will continue to swear down your rotor. It might release it enough to where it doesn't smoke, however it's continuously riding that rotor and not floating the way it should. So if you have uneven wear, most likely, well, almost guarantee that it's a pin issue and your caliper's not floating or it's binding. So those are some things you want to look for. Inspect your hoses. Make sure you don't see any dry rotted hoses. Follow them all the way up. Move them around a little bit. You don't want to disturb them too much, but you want to make sure they're in good condition. Because if you go and you disturb something and it starts leaking, it was only a matter of time before that was going to go anyhow. So you're going to want to inspect your hoses, make sure they're not dry, rotted, and brittle. If you see any dry rot or up around the crimps, if they're looking real bad, replace them. You're better off safe. This is people's lives that you got in hand when you're inspecting brakes, or when you're doing your brakes. You know, people count on them to work. Not just you, but the other people on the road. They count on your brakes to work. So inspect everything, make sure it all looks good, and that should do it. Also inspect your front end components. You're here, you know, while your tire is on, so you can wiggle, do a little wiggle test, see if you have any loose components. I found that this one has a loose tie rod on the right front. However, I'm going to make him aware and tell him that he really shouldn't drive it until it's replaced. But that's all you can do is warn him. I can't hold him down, you know. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. So I just want to try to lead you guys in the right direction and show you what I do to make sure this is safe and do a thorough safety inspection. Okay, another good thing to check before you take and put your tire on is this inner surface where the tire mates up to your rotor, because that's what compresses everything. As you see, I got a build up in here. The chrome's coming off. So I'm going to take it, I'm going to hit this with a wire wheel. That way I know I have a nice true surface, because right now if I put that on, it might be a couple thousandths out in a little bit, and there's another reason to throw your tire out of balance and give you unwanted results. So let me take and clean that up. Okay, now that I got that all cleaned up, I go ahead and reinstall it. Okay, like I mentioned before, once you get your tires snug, you lower your vehicle down, and then you want to torque your lug nuts. And you want to go in a star pattern or a nice cross pattern. Let's start. I think you get the idea. And torque both sides of the spec. You can go over all the tires while you're there, and that way you're reassured that your tires are tight. Okay, next thing you're going to want to do is go in the vehicle and pump the brakes and see how the pedal feels. I'm going to do it nice and slow. Okay, we're pumped back up. Feels good. Now we want to go out and check the fluid. Check your fluid level. Like I said, if nothing was added, it should be back up to the full mark. If not, top it back off to the max. Okay, from there, of course, we'll take it out for a ride, make sure it feels good. Break it in nice and slow. Do a couple starts and stops. And see how the pedal feels. Wouldn't be a bad time to check out the back brakes. If they're drum brakes, go ahead and adjust them up. That way it saves a little life on your front pads. If you're noticing that you're going through front pads a lot, it could be a good indication that your rear pads have been running out of adjustment. So you want to get them so they just touch. If they're drum, if they're disc, they should be adjusting themselves. Other than that, I hope this video helps out. I know there's 1,000,001 brake job videos out there. However, I just wanted to throw you guys one in case you're working on the Eclipse. But this applies to many makes and models. It's pretty straightforward. You know, make sure they're safe and make sure it's done right, and they'll keep coming back to you. Always pump up the brakes. I know I feel like I'm going on and on, but there's a lot of safety stuff involved when you're working on someone's vehicle. You know, a lot of people take a lot of stuff for granted, and one time that something goes wrong, it's going to haunt you. So I do my best to bring everything to the customer's attention that needs to be addressed. Pump those brakes before you take it for a ride. And make sure you take it for a ride and break it in for the customer before they go taking it for a ride and they go down the road and they come back and say, oh no, my brakes are smoking, it's not stopping right. Yeah, just do all that. That way it saves you all the the headaches of that. We had this one guy working for us back in the day when we had the full-blown repair shop. We had an alignment rack. It was a Hunter D111, had its own rack he pulled up on. And he did a brake job on it one time because it had jacks and everything underneath it. It was a real nice setup. However, he did the brake job, slapped it together. He probably did 100 of them on that lift before. However, this time he didn't pump the brakes before he backed off the lift. Well, it was a manual transmission, so he just pushed in the clutch, released emergency brake, put it in reverse, and backed off the lift. When he went to stop, the pedal went to the floor, and it was too late, and he backed right into a phone booth that was outside our garage with a customer's car while they were waiting for it. I could go on and on with stories like that for you guys, but it's sad to say, but a lot of things happen. So take the necessary steps and avoid some of them headaches. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned.